Did you know that the Sabbath commandment is not just an incredibly important, but also incredibly beautiful commandment that has been placed very intentionally at the very heart of the Ten Commandments? And that these two aspects, the position and the design of the Sabbath commandment, reveal why this commandment is so very significant and what the Sabbath is really all about? Let's take a look. Welcome to Masterpiece. My name is Chris, and if you just casually read through the Ten Commandments, you might easily get the impression that it's just a list of 10 important rules God gave to His people that are presented in no particular order. But once you take a closer look, you start to realize that these commandments have actually been arranged in a very, very intentional and beautiful way. Now, there's different views as to what that arrangement looks like. According to some people, the Ten Commandments are made up of two parts of 5 commandments each. First, we've got commandments 1 to 5, because in each one of those commandments, the phrase, "the Lord your God," appears. And then we've got commandments 6 to 10, where that phrase does not occur. But other people say, no, it's really commandments 1 to 4, which concern our relationship to God, and then commandments 5 to 10, which are about our relationship with other human beings. So who's right? Well, in this video, I want to present a third possibility that is actually suggested by the text itself, which I think makes a lot of sense. So you've probably noticed that most of the commandments begin the same way, which of course is with the phrase, "you shall not." But there's 2 commandments that begin differently. The 4th commandment about the Sabbath and the 5th commandment about honoring father and mother, that both begin with a positive statement that in Hebrew does not include a finite verb. Now the interesting thing is that there's actually one more statement like that, and it's at the very beginning where God says, "I am the Lord your God," because in the Hebrew text, there's no verb at all here. And that means that the 10 Commandments can be divided into 3 sections that each begin with a positive statement without a finite verb. First, we have Commandments 1 to 3, which talk about our relationship to God and are introduced by the statement, "I am the Lord your God." Then we have the 4th commandment, which is about our relationship to God and our relationship to other people, and is introduced by the statement, "Remember the Sabbath day." And finally, we have commandments 5 to 10, which are about our relationship to other people and are introduced by the statement, "Honor your father and mother." Now, one of the things that's fascinating about this arrangement is that it really highlights the Sabbath commandment as the central commandment that functions as a turning point and as a kind of hinge between the first 3 and the last 6 commandments, because it focuses on the relationship and responsibility to God, just like the first 3, and it focuses on the relationship and responsibility to other people, just like the last 6. And it's really the only commandment that explicitly includes both of these aspects. So it's like your relationship with God, that's described in the first 3 commandments, leads you into Sabbath rest. And that Sabbath rest then becomes the basis for your relationship with others. Because when you truly experience Sabbath rest, you won't lie or kill or covet. So the Sabbath commandment is key. It's not just one among 10. No, this commandment is actually the focal point of the whole section that encapsulates the entire law. And it's also the longest commandment. So both in terms of length and position, this is the commandment that's highlighted in a special way. Which means, if we want to get a better understanding of God and His law, we need to pay special attention to the Sabbath commandment. But it's not just the arrangement of the 10 commandments as a whole that's really fascinating, but also the arrangement of the Sabbath commandment itself. Because if you look closely, you'll see that there's a very intentional design. Notice that at the beginning it says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy," and then it ends with, "Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." So in both cases, you've got the expression Sabbath day and the word holy. Then in verses 9 to 10, it says, "6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God." And in verse 11 we have, "For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day." So here again, there are clear parallels, which means at the very center of the commandment is the statement about not doing any work, and the list of who shall not do any work. And if you count how many are listed here, you realize that it's exactly 7. You, your son, your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, your livestock, and the stranger or sojourner within your gates. So why is that significant? Well, for one thing, of course, because it fits with the 7th day, but also because the number 7 is connected to the idea of fullness or completion. So even though not every single member of the household is explicitly mentioned here, the number 7 suggests that everyone is included. In other words, Sabbath means complete rest for everyone connected to the household. And that complete rest is at the heart of the Sabbath commandment and at the heart of the entire Decalogue. So what kind of rest are we talking about here? Well, you say it's rest from our work, from the labor we do for a living. And of course that's true. And yet I believe that there's a deeper dimension here. If we take another look at the chiastic arrangement of the Sabbath commandment, it's interesting that in both parts A and A prime, and in parts B and B prime, there's always one statement about God and one statement about us as human beings. So God blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy, and we are to remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. And God made everything in 6 days and rested on the 7th day. And in the same way, we are also to do our work for 6 days and rest on the 7th day. So there's a close connection between what God does and what we do, which means we don't just rest because God tells us to, we rest because He rested. So what is that rest? It's the rest that follows God's work of creation on our behalf. And it's the rest that follows God's work of salvation on our behalf. Because what did Jesus say when He died? It is finished. And then He rested on the Sabbath, which means that salvation is connected to creation, which makes sense because salvation is recreation. It's God coming into our darkness and chaos and death and bringing light and order and life through the Word made flesh, Jesus Christ. In other words, God's work of creation foreshadows His work of salvation, and His rest from the work of creation foreshadows His rest from the work of salvation that He's offering to us. So ultimately, to keep the Sabbath means to acknowledge God as our Creator as well as our Savior, as our Recreator. It means to acknowledge that we cannot save ourselves by our own works, but that we are resting in what Jesus has done for us on the cross, which is precisely what God says at the beginning of the 10 Commandments. He says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Israel didn't deliver themselves from bondage, from a system of never-ending work without Sabbath that would never lead to freedom. God did. He saved Israel, and He offered them rest, and He's offering the same to you and me. And each Sabbath, each 7th day of the week, we have the opportunity to testify to that reality by ceasing from our work and entering into God's complete rest. Isn't that beautiful? Well, I hope this video has been helpful to you, and if you want to learn how you can discover even more fascinating structures like the one in the Sabbath commandment, and why these structures are so important in the Bible, then go watch this video next, and I'll see you there.